This committee will come to order. Pursuant to notice, we meet today to mark up 9 bipartisan measures, and without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements or extraneous materials on today's business. As members were notified yesterday, we intend to consider today's measures en bloc, and so without objection, the following items previously provided to members and also in your packets will be considered en bloc and are considered as read. We have H.R. 1918. This is the Nicaraguan Investment Conditionality Act with the Ross-Leitonen Amendment 33 in the nature of a substitute. We have the H.R. 2061, the North Korea Human Rights Reauthorization Act, Yoho Amendment 60 in the nature of a substitute, and Yoho Amendment 58 to Amendment 60. We have H.R. 2408, Protecting Girls' Access to Education in Vulnerable Settings. We have House Resolution 128, supporting respect for human rights in Ethiopia. We have the Smith Amendment 48 in the nature of a substitute and Smith Amendment 49 to Smith Amendment 48. We have House Resolution 259 condemning the crisis in Venezuela with the DeSantis Amendment in the nature of a substitute to House Resolution 259. House Resolution 311 recognizing the work of ASEAN nations with the Castro Amendment in the nature of a substitute to the House Resolution. We have House Resolution 357 reaffirming the U.S.-Canada partnership with Duncan Amendment 29, House Resolution 359 urging the EU to designate Hezbollah as a terrorist organization with the Deutsch Amendment 27, and lastly, House Resolution 449 urging peaceful and transparent elections in Kenya, and I now recognize myself to speak on today's business. And I recognize here the good work of Representative Deutsch on this House Resolution 359. This urges the European Union to designate Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. Hezbollah has one leadership, fungible finances, and a singular hostile mission. All its branches and operations serve its terrorist agenda, and it is dangerous to try and distinguish among its arms. We must work with our allies to deprive this terrorist organization of its financial support and its logistical support. H.R. 2061 reauthorizes important provisions of the North Korea Human Rights Act. This is the decades-old U.S. humanitarian policy that provides much-needed assistance to North Korean defectors and to refugees. It also promotes freedom of information inside North Korea through radio broadcasting, an issue on which this committee has a long history of promoting critical reforms. As the Kim regime desperately tries to preserve its monopoly on information, these broadcasts are critical to empowering the people of North Korea, and I want to thank Chairman Emeritus Ross-Leitonen and Asia Subcommittee Chairman Yoho for their work on this bill's provisions. House Resolution 311 recognizes the growing importance of the ASEAN nations. For 40 years, the U.S. has expanded its cooperation with this collection of 10 Southeast Asian nations. It has a combined economy of $2.5 trillion. Southeast Asia represents a major opportunity for strengthening U.S. commerce and security interests across that region. On the other side of the globe, the situation in Venezuela continues to deteriorate, and President Maduro continues to dig in with plans to rewrite Venezuela's constitution and give himself full dictatorial powers. This would undo any semblance of democratic order, and I want to thank Mr. DeSantis for his leadership on House Resolution 259, which echoes strong words and actions from the administration, including yesterday's sanctions. These are sanctions on certain individuals in Venezuela who are part of that dictatorship, to warn Maduro against his illegal efforts to rewrite the Constitution. As we look at the crisis in Venezuela, we must be mindful that Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega has been decidedly unhelpful to regional efforts to respond. Indeed, he has been among the corrupt few trying to bolster President Maduro, not to mention pursuing his own undemocratic consolidation of power at home. So I want to thank Chairman Emeritus Ross-Leitonen for authoring H.R. 1918. This measure requires U.S. representatives to international financial institutions to oppose any loan that benefits the government of Nicaragua unless we can certify that Nicaragua is taking steps to reestablish free and transparent elections and respect basic human and democratic rights. I want to thank Chairman Duncan of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee for his leadership on these measures and his resolution reaffirming the U.S.-Canada relationship. Canada continues to be one of our most important allies and a vital trading partner, and House Resolution 357 encourages even greater commercial collaboration. And Mr. Duncan will be leading a delegation of lawmakers to Canada in September for the U.S.-Canada IPG, so we wish him well. I am also proud to support Representative Shabbat's bill to protect girls' access to education in vulnerable settings. With many developing countries hosting large numbers of refugees for longer stretches of time, we are seeing a concerning trend of more children out of school due to conflict. These children, and girls in particular, face an increased risk of exploitation and less hope for their future. So I'm pleased to support H.R. 2408, which authorizes U.S. support for improving girls' access to education in conflict settings. I also want to thank Mr. Smith, Chairman of the Africa Subcommittee, for his work on House Resolution 128. While we recognize our long-standing partnership with Ethiopia, we must also stress the importance of that government's respect for human rights and democratic principles, including the need for Ethiopia to take tangible steps to ensure opposition voices are protected, are respected, and are welcomed. And I'd also like to thank my colleague, Representative Kaufman, for his dedication and leadership in ensuring that this resolution be considered today. And lastly, I want to thank Ranking Member Engel for his timely resolution, underscoring the importance of Kenya's upcoming elections. As a critical leader in the region, this election holds important significance as an example for other African countries with their upcoming elections. I understand two of our colleagues, Representative Bass and Representative Frankel, will travel to observe these elections next month, and we look forward to monitoring the results and wish Kenya the best as they prepare for this momentous occasion. I now recognize our ranking member, Mr. Engel, for his remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling the markup. We've got a number of good bipartisan measures, and I'm glad to support all of them. I'd like to start with a measure I authored which sends a strong message as Kenya prepares for its next elections, and I'm grateful to you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing this resolution up today. I'm grateful to Mr. Smith of New Jersey and Ms. Bass of California, the chair and ranking members of the Africa Subcommittee, who are lead co-sponsors of this legislation. Kenya is an important partner of the United States. This is a country that promotes regional stability and serves as an economic and humanitarian hub for East Africa. We want Kenya to remain strong, and that's why the State Department and USAID have long supported credible, open elections in that country. This has been a challenging time for Kenya, challenging area for Kenya. A decade ago, a wave of violence followed elections, and in 2013, troubling irregularities plagued the voting process there. In advance of the election scheduled for August 8th, this resolution calls upon Kenya to hold credible, peaceful, free, and fair elections and condemn in the strongest terms hate speech and the incitement of violence by political candidates, the media, or any Kenyan citizens. It also calls upon the United States and Kenya's other international partners to continue to support Kenya's efforts to address the remaining electoral preparation challenges and to identify gaps where additional resources or diplomatic engagement could make important contributions to the conduct of the elections. This measure isn't about taking sides in Kenya's politics, but instead reaffirms the importance of our partnership with Kenya and our support for the people of that country as they go to the polls. I wish Ms. Bass and Ms. Frankel are well and proud that they're representing us during that election, and I ask all members to support this resolution. I'd like to say a few words about some other measures we're conducting today. I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor of the North Korean Human Rights Act, introduced by my friend Representative Royce. This measure authorizes the current law until 2022, extending American efforts to promote the human rights of North Koreans and making important adjustments to U.S. broadcasting and other efforts to get unbiased information in to the people of North Korea. These are timely changes, as we're all very concerned by North Korea's advancing weapons capability. I know the Chairman has done a lot of work with Korea. I've been there twice. Don't think we're going to go any in the future or in the short future, but I'm glad to support this measure. I think it sends a very strong message to the North Korean regime. I'm also glad to support another resolution from Chairman Smith calling on authorities in Ethiopia to lift the state of emergency and end the excessive use of force by Ethiopian security forces, urging protesters to refrain from violence and calling on the administration to hold accountable individuals responsible for gross human rights violations. I'm grateful to Mr. DeSantis for his resolution highlighting the devastating political, economic, and humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. With its massive energy resources, Venezuela should be one of the wealthiest countries in the world. It marks a profoundly sad day when our Congress and others in the international community must consider how to most effectively provide food and medicine to the Venezuelan people, but that's the deeply troubling record of the Maduro government. And we've all been very vocal in that, Ms. Ross-Leighton, and probably the most vocal and right on the money, so to speak, through the years, talking about Maduro and his predecessor, Mr. Chavez, both of whom are running that country, have run that country, and are running that country to the ground. Chairman Duncan of our Western Hemisphere Subcommittee has offered a good resolution reaffirming a strategic partnership between the United States and Canada. I'm particularly pleased that this resolution takes note of extensive cooperation between our two countries within NATO at a time when our own administration has questioned the importance of this alliance. Next, I'd again like to thank Representative Ross-Leighton and also Representative Cires for introducing the Nicaraguan Investment Conditionality Act, also known as the NICA Act. President Ortega and his lackeys have shown zero regard for democracy and the rule of law in Nicaragua. This legislation is an important step in holding the Nicaraguan government accountable by opposing loans to these corrupt leaders while taking precautions not to make things worse for the many Nicaraguans who are already suffering in what is the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. I remember when I was chairman of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee, and we visited Ortega in Nicaragua, and we knew there were problems then. There are certainly even greater problems now. I'm also glad to support a measure by Mr. Deutsch of Florida urging the EU to name the Hezbollah organization as a terrorist organization and put greater pressure on Hezbollah fundraising within Europe. In July 2013, the European Union announced that it would consider the military wing of Hezbollah as a terrorist organization after a spike of terrorist activity in Europe. This came after a wave of attacks and attempted attacks perpetrated by Hezbollah in Europe. The United States does not make the distinction, and rightfully so, between the military and political wings of Hezbollah, and frankly, neither does Hezbollah. We consider the whole organization to be a terrorist organization, and the European Union should do the same. I appreciate Representative Castro and Wagner's leadership on the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which we call ASEAN, both in offering this measure and launching the Congressional ASEAN Caucus. This resolution recognizes the 50 years ASEAN has promoted stability, prosperity, and peace in Southeast Asia, and underscores why this institution, and most importantly, the countries that make it up, matter to America's economy and security. And lastly, I am glad to support a bill by Representatives Shabbat and Kelly to help improve access to education for displaced children, especially girls. Around the world, nearly 4 million displaced children don't have access to public education. We know, obviously, this disadvantage can set these young people back for the rest of their lives. So this bill would make it a priority for the State Department and USAID to work with multilateral organizations, with civil society, and with private sector partners to help these vulnerable young people access education and get on a better path forward. I'm grateful to both of my colleagues for introducing this measure. And I'm grateful to members on both sides of the aisle for all their hard work, their willingness to collaborate, and their commitment to advancing good bipartisan legislation that enhances American leadership and security. Mr. Chairman, this has been a hallmark of our committee under your leadership, and I'm delighted to play a part in it. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. We go now to Eliana Ross-Layton. And
thank you so much, Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel, for bringing forth these various bipartisan measures before us today. Mr. Chairman, H.R. 1918, the Nicaraguan Investment Conditionality Act, NICA, of 2017 is a bipartisan bill that I authored alongside my colleague, Albio Sierras. I'm also thankful that Mr. Duncan, chair of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee, has also supported the legislation. The bill aims to press the Ortega regime to improve its human rights practices, to address its problems with corruption within the government, and increase its transparency. And until the government starts implementing some reforms, there should be no reason for the United States to support the Ortega regime receiving more cash while it continues to violate human rights, ignores the rule of law, and perpetuates fraudulent elections. The U.S. Congress has passed bills which have become law, imposing similar conditions on El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, and they have been effective in moving these countries in the right direction. The NICA Act seeks to do the same with Nicaragua. If the electoral system is not changed in Nicaragua, the fraud orchestrated by Ortega will continue. And let us not forget that Ortega invited the Russians into Nicaragua, has let them set up operations there to undermine U.S. national security interests. And it is Ortega who's been leading the charge at the Organization of American States to undermine our efforts to hold the Venezuelan regime accountable. So passing this measure is the right thing to do, because the time to take action in support of the people of Nicaragua and their democratic future is now. The House already passed a similar version of this bill last Congress, and let us make sure that this becomes law. And the next bill, Mr. Chairman, the reauthorization of North Korea Human Rights Act, I first authored it in 2004. It has been an important piece of our U.S.-North Korea policy ever since. I'm proud to lead the law's reauthorization in 2008 and then again in 2012. And I'm thankful to Ranking Member Engel for being our Democratic lead on this bill. Thank you to Chairman Yoho, Ranking Member Sherman, for also joining us in introducing this measure. This bill ensures that essential tools for promoting North Korea human rights continues to be available, including grants for advancing human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, humanitarian assistance for North Korean refugees, defectors, migrants, orphans, and women victims of trafficking, and continued reporting by the Special Envoy for North Korea human rights issues. I also want to thank Chairman Yoho for his leadership and his important amendment, which makes some valuable additions to the bill, including adding new methods of communication so that North Koreans can be aware of their inherent rights and their absent freedoms. I want to briefly express my support for Ted Deutsch's and Gus Bilirakis' resolution, House Resolution 359, because the idea that somehow a terrorist group can be split into a military wing and a political wing, and that somehow one part is a terror group, yet another is not, is beyond absurd. Iran is a state sponsor of terror. Hezbollah is its biggest tool. There can be no justification for this bifurcation. And finally, briefly, to express my support for Ron DeSantis' resolution in support of the Venezuelan people. Mr. DeSantis has been a real champion in this. The deteriorating situation in Venezuela is unacceptable, and I'm grateful that the administration took action yesterday to sanction regime officials in anticipation of the illegal Constituent Assembly planned for this Sunday. We've got to keep the pressure on Maduro, stand in solidarity with the people of Venezuela as they continue with their quest for freedom, democracy, and their fundamental human rights. So thank you to Mr. DeSantis, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I now recognize Mr. Connolly to speak on today's bills.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to support all of the bills in front of us on block and congratulate all of our colleagues for their fine efforts. I thank you and Mr. Engel for your leadership in bringing these bipartisan measures before us. Would that all committees in the Congress could have such comity as we have today. I'd like to speak to one of them in particular, one of those bills in particular, which is H.R. 2061, the North Korea Human Rights Reauthorization Act of 2017. And I want to thank my friend, Eliana Ross-Layton, for introducing this bill the Korean Human Rights Reauthorization Act. The North Korean regime has conducted 17 ballistic missile tests in 2017 alone, including the July 4th launch of an intercontinental ballistic missile capable of reaching Alaska. The United States, the Republic of Korea, and other regional stakeholders must demonstrate a commitment to addressing this threat. At the same time, it's vital that our North Korea policy be informed with an understanding that there are human victims of the ongoing conflict on the peninsula who reside on both sides of the 38th parallel. This bill responds to that imperative by reauthorizing the Human Rights Act of 2004 and prioritizing the protection of North Korean refugees and defectors. I want to thank Ms. Ross-Lehtinen for working with me on an amendment we adopted to H.R. 2061 that requires a report on ongoing or planned efforts regarding the repatriation of members of the United States Armed Forces, the reunification of Korean Americans with relatives in North Korea, and an assessment of security risks posed by travel to North Korea for U.S. citizens. And of course, we now have a ban on such travel. The division of North and South Korea along the 38th parallel offers one of the world's most striking dichotomies. Yet on both sides of the DMZ resides a shared pain. The pain is that of families ripped apart by the Korean War and an enduring division of one people into two countries. Reunions are a welcome respite from that separation, but in the end provide yet another reminder that family reunification on the peninsula is all too fleeting. Many of these Americans, more than 100,000 according to the last estimate, have been waiting to reunite with their family members in North Korea, in some cases since the armistice or the ceasefire of the Korean War 60 years ago. Too many have already passed away without realizing that fervent hope that they would see the faces of their loved ones one more time. This amendment would require an update on efforts to conduct family reunification for those Korean Americans. It would also help heal old wounds by addressing the issue of repatriation of members of the U.S. Armed Forces who have been missing since the Korean War 60 years ago. I thank the Chair, thank all of my colleagues for their hard efforts, and I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Smith to speak on today's bills.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me first of all thank you for co-sponsoring and Elliot Engel a resolution that Karen Bass and I have put together, HRES 128. I want to thank Mike Kaufman for his leadership. It's been extraordinary on this resolution as well. Thank you, Mike. This resolution is like a mirror held up to the government of Ethiopia on how others see them, and it's intended to encourage them to move on reforms. Ethiopia is an important ally and partner in international peacekeeping. However, the continuing violations of human rights are absolutely unacceptable. I would note that the country reports on human rights practices couldn't be more clear, put out by the U.S. Department of State, and they cite serious human rights violations, including arbitrary arrests, killings, and torture committed by security forces, restrictions on freedom of expression and the freedom of association, politically motivated trials, harassment, and intimidation of opposition members and journalists. And when you read the report, it is like an indictment against the government of Ethiopia. Let me say to my colleagues that just yesterday I sent a letter to the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services on behalf of Demsu Abebe to get his family humanitarian parole to enter the United States and to remove the threats expressed to them by government forces. Demso was a track star, a world-class track star, who was tortured by the Ethiopian security forces in a way that made his ability to run go away. They tortured him on his feet so he couldn't run. I mean, that is so despicable, and it's just part of what I think is a very malevolent attitude towards people who disagree with them on human rights. I spoke to him in person on this. We had him at a press conference, and again, his story was absolutely compelling. Another victim of government torture, Abaguya Edeke, testified at our subcommittee's hearing on Ethiopia on March 9th. Abaguya is disabled and headed a government organization for disabled persons in Ethiopia. when he refused to join the ruling party or to sign off on what he described as the misuse of donated equipment for disabled people. He was jailed and made to crawl around his cell without his wheelchair, and in a subsequent imprisonment, he was taken from his cell and left in a forest without his wheelchair to die, vulnerable to wild animals. Fortunately, he was able to set a fire and was saved by some kind people who spotted the fire and came to his aid. These are not actions of a government that respects human rights, as they say they do, and they have a very good PR campaign, I have to admit, but it's all about the deeds, not the words, and the deeds, again, continue to be, I think, egregious. My staff and I, Greg Simpkins and I, first traveled on one of many trips to Ethiopia in 2005, and I can tell you we have been trying to get this government to respect fundamental human rights. And one of the findings or the Sense of Congress statements is that we want individuals to be held accountable for gross violations of human rights in Ethiopia through appropriate mechanisms, including using the new Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act to hold those individuals to account. Again, I want to thank the 50 members who have co-sponsored, and I do hope the members will support the resolution.
Mr. Ted Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to join my colleagues in expressing support for all of the measures before us today, and to join all who have already expressed their appreciation for the bipartisan leadership of this committee from our chairman and our ranking member. I'd like to especially thank the chairman for bringing forward my resolution urging the EU to designate Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. And I thank the members of this committee on both sides of the aisle who have co-sponsored this legislation. Mr. Chairman, in 2013, the EU designated Hezbollah's military wing, but not its political wing, as a terrorist organization. This is a false distinction. Hamas in Gaza, ISIS in Iraq and Syria. They both administer government services, but the EU, no one would ever suggest that they aren't terrorist organizations. Hezbollah is a terrorist organization, one unified terrorist organization. It has one leader, Hassan Nasrallah, a U.S.-designated terrorist who even before becoming leader of Hezbollah was directly involved in attacks, hostage-taking, and airline hijackings. Hezbollah was responsible for the 1983 bombings in Beirut, one on the U.S. Embassy that killed 17 Americans and 46 others, and one on the U.S. Marine barracks that killed 241 American Marines and dozens of French service members. Hezbollah killed 23 more Americans the following year in an attack on the U.S. Embassy and annex in Beirut. And then in 1985, summarily executed a U.S. Navy diver during the hijacking of TWA 847. Hezbollah is also responsible for the 1992 Israeli embassy bombing in Argentina, which killed 29 people, and the 1994 bombing of a Jewish center in Buenos Aires that killed 85 people. In 1996, Hezbollah killed 19 more U.S. service members in the Khobar Towers bombing in Saudi Arabia. And 5 years ago this month, a Hezbollah suicide bomber blew up a bus in Bulgaria, killing 6 Israelis and Bulgarians. And thousands of Hezbollah fighters at the direction of Iran have now been sent to Syria to prop up the brutal Assad regime, which is responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths. Iran's leaders seek to cement Hezbollah's hold on parts of Syria so that it has a direct line to Hezbollah in Lebanon and to add to its arsenal over 150,000 rockets aimed at every corner of Israel. This is not an organization that should be allowed to skirt the consequences of its terrorist activity by parading as a political entity. Last year, the Gulf Cooperation Council and the Arab League both designated Hezbollah a terrorist organization. I urge our European friends to take note and to finally designate Hezbollah without artificial distinction as a terrorist organization. The EU's designation of the Hezbollah's military wing has already enabled substantial cooperation with the United States to uncover and to thwart Hezbollah's international criminal activities, including drug trafficking, counterfeiting, and money laundering, and we appreciate that cooperation. The full designation, though, would allow for significantly improved cooperation to freeze Hezbollah's assets in Europe, prohibit fundraising activities in support of Hezbollah, all to help prevent more devastating terror attacks by this terrorist organization. I urge my colleagues to join me in sending this important message to our European friends and allies, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I recognize Mr. Rohrabacher of California to speak on today's bills.
Thank you very much. I rise in support of the bills that have been presented to us today. I especially would like to focus on a number of areas where Ethiopia, for example, I want to congratulate Chairman Smith on a great job of analyzing the type of tyranny that is evident in Ethiopia. This is a corrupt regime that is also oppressive and brutal with its own people. Let me note that its corruption spills beyond its own borders. We have U.S. citizens whose property was confiscated by the Ethiopian government, and arrogantly the Ethiopian government expects the U.S. to continue in a good relationship with it, and perhaps even giving some type of aid to Ethiopia when it actually has stolen property that it refuses to give back to U.S. citizens. I know that personally because we have a very prominent family in Orange County, California, whose property was confiscated, and after continuing to try, they get nowhere after years of attempting. But that property damage is nowhere, and property theft is nowhere near as offensive to our values as is the murder and repression and the torture that goes on in Ethiopia. What we have is a dictatorship that knows no bounds. So I very appreciate this bill. I also would like to note that Venezuela keeps sinking further into the depths of tyranny and injustice, and let us hope that we, while the situation is still fluid enough, that we stand with the people of Venezuela in creating a real democracy there, rather than this tough guy leftists who love Fidel Castro and other low-life dictators serves as their model. And finally, about Hezbollah, another thing, I identify with myself with the remarks that were just made by my colleague about Hezbollah. Look, it's time for the Palestinians to understand peace is in their hands, and they have the ability to make peace with Israel. There was a two-state solution that was accepted, and there was great hopes for that. But it's the continuing violence against Israel, organized violence against Israel, that is destroying any chances for peace in that region. And we cannot blame Israel for retaliating against forces that are killing their own people and shooting rockets into their country. So today we are reaffirming that Hezbollah should be designated as a terrorist organization as it continues to push for war and continues to kill innocent people. Let me just note that there was a hearing here, I believe it was yesterday, in which we were talking about Qatar, and one of the things they said about Qatar was the good thing was that they helped rebuild destruction in Gaza. That is not a pro-peace solution, and in fact, Qatar's rebuilding those buildings that had been destroyed in retaliation for the missile attacks and rocket attacks on Israel only encourages more missile attacks on Israel. So Hezbollah and Hamas and the other Palestinian organizations that are active in that part of the world, we must be very clear that we want peace. We want them to make peace with the rest of the world, and they are not doing so, and they are conducting themselves in a way that they should become the pariahs of decent peoples and countries throughout the world. So I would, that whole notion is something that runs through this list of resolutions. I want to thank the chairman, and I want to thank the ranking member for helping focus this committee, this with our basically bipartisan support on these type of values. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I rise in support of these resolutions.
Thank you. We go to Lois Frankel of Florida on today's bills.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank you, the ranking member, and all the members who have participated in putting together these very fine bills, which I know, co-sponsor some of them. I really wanted to make a comment on three of those. And the first on urging the European Union to designate Hezbollah in its entirety as a terrorist organization and increase pressure on it and its members. So I'm going to start with an analogy. It's probably not the best one, but maybe my colleague here can help me figure out a better one. But I came in here today and I saw a bottle of water, which is pretty good. I drink the water, but when you think about it, what is water made out of? Hydrogen and oxygen, is that right? So to me, and I don't think you can have water without the hydrogen or the oxygen. And to me, this is what this resolution, I know it's an analogy, I'm not sure if it's that great, but I think you will all tell me, all right? Yeah, you know, to try to separate the political and the military wing of Hezbollah, to me, is like saying, well, you know, separating the hydrogen and oxygen and saying, well, you have water. Okay, I think you get what I mean. My colleagues have made a lot of good comments about this. I think that the piece that I want to stress is how Hezbollah is really being used as a proxy by what I think many of us consider one of the most, if not the most dangerous country in the world, and that is Iran, which is trying to take over Iraq, Syria, to name a couple of countries, Yemen. They are destabilizing and dangerous in many areas that we are very, very concerned about. And so they have to be stopped. And I think this resolution goes towards that direction. On a what I would hope is a more positive note of inspiration is our urging or our resolution to work with children or displaced children towards education. You know, in reading about it, I think there's about 25 million of the world's out-of-school children who are in conflict zones. Think about that. What does that mean? We're talking about a lost generation. And here's what's happening. Not only are the kids not getting educated, but here is what is happening. Now, we'll use Syria as an example. They're not only getting educated, but the number of young girls who are now forced into child marriage has doubled from 12 to 26%. I mean, you imagine 12-year-olds, 14-year-old girls being forced to get married. You have child labor rapidly increasing in very illegal and unsafe conditions. And I think as important is a complete lack of hope for young people. What happens to young people when they have no hope, no education, no potential of a real job other than maybe one day joining some terrorist organization or being the victims of one? So I thank this committee for that resolution on education. And then, I don't know, Ms. Bass is not here, but I also want to say something about urging Kenya to have a fair and safe election. Some of us will be traveling to the region to monitor that election, and I wish us well on that. But I think it is very important to us to support democracies and fair election any place in this world. And With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Mr. Steve Shabbat of Ohio on today's bills.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this important markup. I support all the bills. I'll focus on one in particular. It's become apparent that the challenges that many girls across the globe face are daunting. Many of those difficulties begin at birth when millions of children, mostly girls, are not properly registered. They don't have birth certificates, making it easier for those children to disappear in human trafficking networks or be coerced into childhood marriage, as Ms. Frankel just indicated, or forced labor. That's why in the House, Betty McCollum and myself in a bipartisan way, and Marco Rubio and Senator Shaheen over in the Senate introduced legislation to bolster efforts to develop birth certificates and national registries for children in developing countries. That legislation was passed by this committee. It was passed by both houses, and President Obama signed it into law. That was about 2 years ago. However, another equally important aspect of the problem facing girls, as Ms. Frankel just indicated, is access to education. As a former teacher myself in an inner-city school, I've seen firsthand how education empowers children. Unfortunately, millions of children receive no education due to circumstances beyond their control. This is particularly true for the growing number of displaced people around the world, as it is exceedingly difficult for children in conflict zones to receive a primary or a secondary education. Armed conflicts across the world, particularly in places like Syria, South Sudan, and others, have resulted in the internal displacement of millions of women and children and forced them to literally flee their homes. Education is one of the key components in helping lift this most vulnerable population out of the depths of poverty and the difficult circumstances that they are facing. Access to education not only gives children the opportunity to grow and learn, but also offers safety and shelter from the violence that's going on in the circumstances around them, safety from extremist ideology and human trafficking networks, and a horrible cycle of abuse. Simply stated, access to education provides stability and consistency to children living in extremely unstable conditions, especially girls. Boys also are involved in this, but girls are particularly vulnerable to this. It's our responsibilities as leaders of the free world to step up and ensure that education, a basic right, is accessible to all. I want to thank my colleague on the other side of the aisle, Robin Kelly of Illinois, for her leadership in introducing the legislation, one of the pieces that we're discussing here this morning, H.R. 2408, the Protecting Girls' Access to Education Act. It will move us in the right direction by calling on the Secretary of State and USAID, previously known as USAID. I still have a hard time, whether it's USAID, USAID. Aid makes more sense, but if you've been around here a while like I have, sometimes you struggle with that one. But USAID now, to prioritize access to primary and secondary education. It aims to directly benefit displaced children, specifically girls, and will help to address one of the world's biggest challenges facing refugees. This legislation also encourages greater international coordination and promotes needed education for refugees where they are through local schools. The Protecting Girls' Access to Education Act will ensure that millions of child refugees will have an opportunity to reach their highest potential, even those in the most dire conditions. So I again want to thank my colleague Robin Kelly for her hard work on this legislation, and hopefully we can continue to work on things down the road, because as the chairman knows, this is one committee that really does work in a bipartisan fashion. I wish the rest of the Congress did it. The other committee that I happen to chair, the House Small Business Committee with Nydia Velasquez, we actually work in a pretty bipartisan way as well. So the rest of the Congress should model themselves after those two committees. So with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you. Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii to speak on today's bills. Nope. We then go to Norma Torres, I think, is next in the queue. All right. Who seeks recognition? Joaquin Castro of Texas.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to thank all of the members whose bills are being considered before us today. Representative Wagner and I co-founded the Congressional Caucus on ASEAN earlier this year to deepen the United States and Congress's engagement with Southeast Asia. ASEAN, as you know, serves as an example of successful regional cooperation. The nations of Southeast Asia, despite distinct histories, cultures, and religions, have placed their faith in cooperation rather than conflict. U.S. security interests in Southeast Asia are wide-ranging and supported by many regional partners. Members of ASEAN have worked closely with the United States to address mutual security concerns. Two members, the Philippines and Thailand, are treaty allies of the United States. Singapore and the United States cooperate closely to safeguard the maritime passageways of Southeast Asia and maintain a rules-based order in the Asia-Pacific region. U.S. relationships with other ASEAN members, such as Vietnam, have grown in recent years as we not only acknowledge our past, but also partner for a brighter future. The member states of ASEAN hold significant economic promise, and our economic relationship underpins much of U.S. engagement with the region. My home state of Texas exports over $13 billion worth of goods to ASEAN countries each year. These exports support over 70,000 Texas jobs and over 500,000 jobs across the United States. The U.S.-ASEAN relationship is also built on history and cultural exchange. Millions of Americans can trace their family roots to the countries of ASEAN, including over 400,000 Texans. Tourism to and from ASEAN exposes hundreds of thousands of people to our cultures and communities across the Pacific. Language, literature, food, and music link our cultures across the ocean, set roots, and enrich both of our societies. House Resolution 311, the resolution we're considering here today, is part of Americans' continuing engagement with ASEAN. It commemorates the 50th anniversary of the founding of ASEAN, and I'm proud to present it here today. Thank you.
Is Mr. Duncan seeking recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a few quick words. I want to thank you and the committee for continuing to stand up for the people of Venezuela against oppression. I want to commend Mr. DeSantis for his Resolution 259, which I fully support. And I appreciate the President talking about sanctions yesterday and continuing to point out how bad a constituent assembly would be in the face of democratic principles that should be in place in Venezuela. I also want to thank the committee for its continued efforts to support democracy and human rights all across the globe, not just Venezuela, but anywhere that human rights are violated. On the Canada Resolution 357, the time is right to reaffirm our partnership with our close friends, and Canada is our best friend. They're our second largest trading partner. The strategic alliances that we have with our friends to the north are important, and this resolution reaffirms that. Thirdly, I want to point out Hezbollah is a terrorist organization, and anytime we can point that out and point out the fact that they are backed by Iran, and neither Iran nor Hezbollah has America's best interest at heart, and we should encourage our allies, whether they're in Europe or anywhere they may be, to point out that Hezbollah is a terrorist organization. So I commend and even support the words of Ms. Frankel. And with that, Mr. Chairman, this is a good markup, a good slate of bills, and I look forward to supporting them all. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Duncan. Any other members seeking recognition? Mr. Brad Sherman, California, on today's bills.
I want to commend the chair and the ranking member for bringing to us 9 well-crafted bipartisan bills. I want to commend the authors of each of them. Particularly want to thank the committee for focusing at the full committee level on human rights in East Africa. My wife works on that every day at the State Department, and it's good that I can go back and tell her that I'm also doing my part. In particular, I want to praise the chair of the Africa Subcommittee, Mr. Smith, and I would lavishly praise the ranking member, Karen Bass, if she were here. And in any case, the work of that subcommittee is to be commended. I want to associate myself with Ted Deutsch's remarks about Hezbollah. This is an international terrorist organization, and no one in Europe should be fooled into thinking that it is a Lebanese political party or that you can separate the actions of the political wing from the military wing, which is like blaming some of the fingers but not all of the fingers on the hand that holds the gun and shoots the innocent person. Keep in mind that Hezbollah has done more than any other organization that perhaps, but along with Russia and Iran, to support Assad's tyranny in Syria, kill nearly 500,000 people, and create a refugee crisis that Europe is suffering from. Perhaps if Europe had dealt with Hezbollah effectively in the past, Europe would not face the refugee crisis that it faces today. We can't be sure. As ranking member of the Asia Subcommittee, I commend to the full committee 2 bills on Asia, and thank Chairman Yoho for his leadership of that subcommittee. The first deals with North Korea human rights. I want to commend our former chair of the full committee, Eliana Ross-Layton, and I also support Chairman Yoho's amendment to authorize the President to distribute or provide grants to provide information receiving devices, electronically reachable devices, so many North Koreans get their information smuggled in through devices that simply didn't exist 10 or 20 years ago. Finally, I should commend the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Castro, for his bill on ASEAN, and with that, I yield back.
Mr. Yoho of Florida on today's bills.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to share my support for H.R. 2061, the North Korean Human Rights Reauthorization Act of 2017. I commend Chairman Emeritus Ross-Layton for leading this reauthorization effort, as she has done in the past. The substitute amendment I've offered for this legislation reflects the work performed at the subcommittee markup, and I thank my colleagues on the Asia-Pacific Subcommittee for joining me to move this legislation forward in the legislative process. The horrific human rights abuses committed by Kim Jong-un are an integral part of his power structure. Countering these unspeakable crimes, however we can, is both a moral imperative and sound strategy. I've also offered a second amendment to this legislation, and I thank Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel for including it in today's unblocked package. This amendment will attach the Distribution and Promotion of Rights and Knowledge Act to today's reauthorization. Importantly, this amendment will expand the authority of the President and the Broadcasting Board of Governors to transmit and distribute information inside North Korea, one of the surest ways to weaken the Kim's regime's grip on power. The 2 bills are natural partners and represent an important step to promote human rights and the free flow of information in North Korea. Again, I thank the Chairman and Ranking Member and yield back.
Thank you. We go to Brad Schneider of Illinois to speak on the bills.
Thank you, Chairman Royce. I want to thank Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel for holding this markup today. I appreciate the consideration of these bipartisan pieces of legislation that address key foreign policy issues, and I am proud to add my voice to those of my colleagues in supporting these measures. I am particularly pleased that today we are marking up House Resolution 359, which I am honored to co-sponsor with my colleagues. This resolution urges the European Union to designate Hezbollah in its entirety as a terrorist organization. The EU designated Hezbollah's military wing as a terrorist organization in 2013 and has made notable progress in countering Hezbollah activities. But more must be done. As the resolution states, we urge the EU to take practical and tangible steps to reduce the terrorist threat that posed to the United States, Europe, Israel, and our other allies in the Middle East by Hezbollah. For example, increasing cross-border intelligence sharing, freezing Hezbollah assets, prohibiting Hezbollah fundraising activities, and issuing arrest warrants for Hezbollah members and supporters in Europe would not only send a strong message, but it would have a concrete impact inhibiting the ability of Hezbollah to operate with impunity. Let's be clear, There is no distinction between the military and political wings of Hezbollah. They are part and parcel of the same entity, and that is a terrorist organization that threatens the United States and our allies and contributes to the instability of the Middle East and the suffering of millions of people. I am also proud to co-sponsor H.R. 2061 that reauthorizes the North Korean Human Rights Act of 2004, extending its provisions until 2022. While North Korea poses a grave and growing threat to the security of the United States, those who suffer most at the hands of the brutal regime of Kim Jong-un are the North Korean people themselves, who lack basic freedoms, are subject to torture and oppression, and are denied access to the basic goods and services. This bill also authorizes support for democracy and governance and humanitarian assistance programs for North Korea in recognition of the vital role that our diplomacy and development programs play in addressing conflict situations. In addition, I offer my support for the other pieces of legislation being marked up today, supporting human rights and democratic elections, protecting vulnerable women and girls, and reaffirming the United States' enduring bilateral and multilateral relationship with allies around the world. The national security of the United States rests upon three pillars: defense, diplomacy, and development. We must ensure that our foreign policy continues to use all of the tools available to us in appropriate balance with each other. Indeed, these pieces of legislation exemplify how crucial it is that we maintain robust support for the Department of State and the U.S. Agency for International Development, so that they can continue to advance our national priorities and sustain our position as a global leader in democracy, human rights, poverty alleviation, and defense of the world's most vulnerable populations. I would like to thank the committee again for considering these important and relevant bills, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you. We go to Mr. Ted Poe of Texas on today's bills.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to comment on two of these pieces of legislation. First, the North Korea Human Rights Reauthorization Act. If we look around the world, there's no greater violator of human rights than North Korea. The people of that country live in a life of hopeless slavery, and they are denied nearly all the basic human rights that most countries believe in. Freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of movement are non-existent in the Kingdom of North Korea. Little Kim and his cronies have absolutely no concern for human life and decency. Hundreds of thousands of North Koreans are held in camps for political prisoners. In many cases, 3 generations of the same family are detained together in these prison work camps. They are routinely beaten, they're tortured, and if they're not executed, many die from starvation. Live births are prohibited in these prison camps. Forced abortions, killing of the newborn babies are standard procedure in North Korea in these prison camps. The North Korean regime is not content simply with controlling these camps. Little Kim is a just paranoid dictator. He and his fathers have tried to control all aspects of their people's lives, even their beliefs. According to the regime, only the Kim family should be worshipped, and they expect that. Christians are particularly singled out for persecution. Bibles are outlawed. A person can be thrown in jail for professing any and all religious beliefs. The people of North Korea suffer on a scale not imaginable anywhere in the world today. 2 million people have died of starvation since the 1990s. Nearly 1 out of every 10 children suffers from malnutrition, and 4 out of 10 are malnutrition. These tragic figures are the direct result of decisions of the North Korean regime. Their slavery of their people does not just include the borders of North Korea. North Korea takes people in North Korea and sells them on the marketplace of slavery to other countries like China, and sends their workers to China where they work, and the money that is paid to the workers never goes to the workers. It goes to the government of China. And China is complicit in this slave trade and the slavery of humans from North Korea going to its country. The world basically did away with slavery many, many years ago, but yet we see it raising its ugly head again in Little Kim's regime. it's amazing to me what a country can do to its own people. I think we're morally and legally obligated on behalf of those people who cannot help themselves, and we can't just watch while millions starve to death. Support this reauthorization of the North Korea Human Rights Act. Commend my colleague, the gentlelady Royce Layton, for her work. North Koreans people deserve basic humanity. The other issue that I'd like to mention is the Hezbollah Bill 359, and encouraging our European friends to recognize them as a terrorist organization. Historically, if we look at Europe, especially since the 30s, they are late coming to the table to realize threats to their own nation and their own continent. And then Europe tries to act, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, to threats that are obvious from outsiders. And I would hope that Europe understands that Hezbollah is a threat to them, that they are not, as my friend Mr. Sherman said from California, a political organization. They're a terrorist organization that does things politically as well. So I hope they realize the importance to work with the United States on Hezbollah. Hezbollah is in many places in the world, not just one place. And Hezbollah is funded from the #1 terrorist state in the world out of 195 countries, and that's our country of Iran. Europe needs to recognize the threat within their own borders, and they need to do it as soon as they can. And that's just the way it is, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield to you.
Thank you. Thank you for yielding back, Mr. Poe. I think our last speaker is Robin Kelly of Illinois on this measure. Ambassador Wagner, did you seek time as well? We go to Robin Kelly of Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm honored to introduce with Congressman Steve Chabot H.R. 2408, the Protecting Girls' Access to Education Act, a bill that would provide all children of all genders access to quality education. I thank the chairman for including this bill in our final markup before August recess, and I encourage all of my colleagues to support it. At the beginning of this year, 65 million people had been displaced from their homes, half of whom were 18 or younger. Too often, these children are not only subject to violence and discrimination, but they are also stripped of their basic human right to an education. The UN Refugee Agency recently reported that 4 million displaced children are without access to elementary school, and 88% of displaced children will never attend college. Without access to primary and secondary education, these children become increasingly vulnerable to the most appalling human rights abuses. Lacking comfort and stability, displaced children are targeted for sex trade, abduction, child labor, early marriage, extreme poverty, and abuse. For the millions of displaced children, especially young girls, school may provide their only means of escape. Education helps children cope with trauma, avoid sexual violence, and transition into their new lives. The classroom environment gives them a sense of normalcy, community support, and helps them overcome isolation and resentment. In addition, college and career training programs equip displaced students with the skills and confidence they need to become responsible members of their communities. For this reason, I have worked closely with Congressman Chabot to introduce H.R. 2408, the Protecting Children's Access to Education Act. With this bill, Congressman Chabot and I hope to provide displaced children, especially young girls, with the economic, emotional, and educational opportunities they deserve. H.R. 2408 calls on the U.S. government to collaborate with donors, private organizations, and other countries to include displaced children into the global public school system. Our bill supports programs that close a language barrier between teachers and displaced students, and that train displaced students for college and careers. The Protecting Girls' Access to Education Act would authorize the Secretary of State and the Administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development to provide efforts that provide safe, accessible education to displaced children and to measure the success of these efforts. Most importantly, our bill would help educational institutions prevent discrimination against displaced children, especially young girls, who often become victims of bullying and sexual harassment. I also applaud Congressman Rubio and Congressman Menendez for introducing the companion bill in the Senate. Together, we have led a comprehensive bipartisan effort to improve the lives of displaced children. I look forward to seeing its enactment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Ambassador Ann Wagner of Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to first state my strong support for all of the bills that we are marking up today, but I want to speak specifically in support of House Resolution 311, the resolution that I was honored to introduce with my colleague, Representative Castro, to commemorate ASEAN's 50th anniversary and the 40th anniversary of U.S.-ASEAN relations. Southeast Asia has tremendous cultural, political, historical, and religious diversity. ASEAN was formed in part to create a bulwark against communism in Southeast Asia among these diverse nations. Today, ASEAN's goals have evolved, and the region is experiencing tremendous growth. Nearly $100 billion of U.S. goods and services are exported to the ASEAN, rivaling our $113 billion market in China. In January, I founded the Bipartisan Congressional Caucus on ASEAN with my friend and colleague, Congressman Castro. The caucus acknowledges America's special relationship with ASEAN and is pushing Congress forward in strengthening engagement in Southeast Asia. House Resolution 311 was one of our first initiatives, and the resolution encourages the enhancement of economic and defense cooperation with ASEAN. It reaffirms the U.S. commitment to continue joint efforts with ASEAN to halt human smuggling and human trafficking, and urges ASEAN to improve assistance to refugees and migrants. I'm grateful that the Chair and Ranking Member are strong supporters of this effort, and I look forward to next seeing this resolution on the House floor. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Wagner. Hearing no further requests for recognition, the question occurs on the items considered en bloc. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it, and the measures considered en bloc are agreed to. Without objection, the measures considered en bloc are ordered favorably reported as amended. Staff is directed to make any technical and conforming changes, and the Chair is authorized to seek House consideration under suspension of the rules. And that concludes our business here today. I thank the Ranking Member and all of our committee members for their contributions and assistance with this markup, and the committee is adjourned.